This episode is presented by Mercury, the fintech that simplifies how more than 200,000 businesses operate.
Hello, and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. Today is Friday, October 25th. I'm Kirsten Korosec, and joining me today is Devin Coldewey for our last recording before, drumroll please, Disrupt. Devin, what are you most excited for, besides seeing me, for next week?
I was going to say seeing you, but then I'm thinking maybe recording Equity. It's going to be so fun. So we're going to do it live. But
wow,
really,
I could tell by the sound of your voice and inflection that you truly are actually excited about recording a live show at Disrupt.
That's what people tell me, that they love my inflection. I genuinely am most excited about seeing all my colleagues. We don't get to see each other as much as I'd like. I'm sure many of our listeners can sympathize with, virtual environments and remote work and stuff. It's just great to get together with everybody and shoot the breeze.
Shoot the breeze, yeah. And actually, I'm really excited because our other co-host today, who I have not seen in person in forever, TechCrunch's Anthony Ha, is not only on today's show, but we get to see him in person for the first time in I want to say 3 years. So Anthony, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's probably more like 5 years because the last Disrupt I did as a TechCrunch staffer was in 2020. Obviously, that was virtual. So I think the last one where I was there in person with all of you was 2019, which is horrifying to think about.
What?
It's absolutely
crazy.
Horrifying, I know.
Yeah, but I'll be there and I'll be hosting the Startup Battlefield, which I know we're going to talk about later.
It'll be just like old times.
Yeah, just like old times.
Pre-pandemic.
Pre-pandemic old times. Well, I am stoked to see everyone in real life. And I should actually mention that Margot, who's been joining us on the show regularly, she's actually doing a little pre-Disrupt travel, but she will be there on stage with us live Tuesday at 9 a.m. And I hope to see all of your smiling faces there. But we should probably move on to today's show. We're going to talk about Stripe 1.0, Freeform. We're also going to talk about what Andreessen Horowitz is doing with NVIDIA GPUs, and back to what Anthony was teasing earlier, Disrupt Battlefield 2024. We want to start off with an interesting acquisition, Anthony. Tell us about Stripe acquiring Bridge for $1.1 billion. Seems like a lot of money for this.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. Certainly, we can start with it's a great exit. They'd only raised $58 million previously. I think their previous valuation was $200 million. So this is just a huge step up. Shout out to Margot. She wrote about this deal when it was still in talks, but now it is official. And what Bridge does is it basically helps companies accept stablecoins. Stablecoins are basically the kinds of crypto that are tied to fiat currency. So there's USDC, which is tied to the US dollar. I was trying to wrap my head around this deal and just this idea of paying more than $1 billion for a crypto startup in 2024. Ever, but certainly this year was not necessarily the hottest thing. But Stripe has been investing in crypto this year. It seems like one of their big focuses. And in fact, Patrick Collison, who's the CEO of Stripe, he described stablecoins as, quote, the room temperature superconductors of finance. So I think he does see this as something that could potentially really accelerate the company's growth.
Okay.
Well, I always wonder if there's things we don't know about in running a giant company like Stripe with all the finance and regulations and stuff. Is it possible that they're dealing with a lot in backend fees and bank stuff? And they're if every dollar was just a number, the original sort of cryptocurrency promise of every dollar is just a number. If they can just move those around the way that we all thought we would, 8 years ago, then maybe they can avoid millions of dollars in, the kind of just fees and costs that these companies incur.
That makes sense to me. That both in terms of them avoiding fees, but also I think Stripe is at a point where it's so ubiquitous that it's really probably you have to kind of be ambitious and far-thinking in terms of figuring out where the opportunities for growth are, because a lot of the basic stuff of just adding Stripe to a bunch of websites, they've done that, right? So they have to figure out what's next. And so obviously trying to maybe become more profitable by shifting things over to crypto, maybe, but also just if they're like, well, if we could have more international transactions, if we could make these kinds of international purchases easier through crypto, that I don't know that that's guaranteed to work, but I think that there's maybe a feeling of, well, we have to keep pushing.
Yeah, and certainly stablecoins make the more. If I was investing, I have a couple of, like a fraction of a Bitcoin and a couple of Ether, but like, I feel like if I was actually going to buy and use some kind of cryptocurrency, like it would be some kind of stable coin, because I'm like, well, yeah, because I'm using it as a dollar. It'll just be a virtual dollar. It's that simple.
All right. So the interesting thing that you were both talking about a little bit was sort of this idea that like Stripe needs to do something new. And I always kind of go back to the question, like, at what cost? And also the timing is so interesting to me for this. Sure, they have to push the boundaries of what their business is and be forward thinking. And the stablecoin idea seems to make sense. But at the end of the day, like, there's also this whole election coming up and like questions around the future of crypto. Have you given that any thought? Or is that like, let's see what happens after November?
Well, when you talk about cost, right, is it like cost to the company or cost to broader society? Which we could have a conversation about crypto and society. I would say in terms of cost to the company, I think that right now, obviously, a lot of the big tech companies are chasing this dream of AI. And before that, it was, in some cases, crypto, in some cases, like the metaverse. And I don't think necessarily any of those bets have really panned out yet. Maybe they will in the future, but they've arguably been a distraction from the things that made them good. And so you could argue that Google, for example, has not done well by its core products because it's been chasing these kind of future things. And so you could imagine a scenario. I don't use Stripe enough to say with authority, but like you can imagine a scenario where Stripe is chasing crypto and then just the core payment experience is not necessarily getting the attention it deserves.
Mm-hmm.
Well, cool. We'll have to see how that all shakes out. I want to talk about this deal that Ingrid wrote about this company called 10. And it's an AI fintech startup, which we never hear about AI fintech startups. What's that? Like, what a weird concept. Never.
Strange.
But what made me really pay attention to this article is that the founder or the person behind it is actually the founder and CEO of Mobileye, Dr. Amnon Shashua. He's really interesting because he takes incredibly long views, circling back to like Stripe pushing forward and looking ahead. He takes incredibly long views of what he eventually wants to do, and in the case of Mobileye, has. And for those who aren't familiar, Mobileye, which was acquired by Intel and then spun out to be a publicly traded company, basically they're in millions, tens of millions of vehicles. They got their start as computer vision, really supporting those advanced driver assistance systems. But now they're doing a lot of self-driving tech. They're kind of everywhere. They really sort of have a monopoly. And Amnon is getting into all these new other startups based in Israel, and 10 is one of them. So I just find that part of it really interesting. I wasn't sure if either one of you were interested in the actual what 10 is trying to do.
Well, there is one thing that I did find interesting in the description of it, where they talk about this idea of the future being one where there's no physical bank and no humans to help at all, which, I mean, I think that's the subtext for a lot of kind of like neobanks that don't have physical locations, is that's what they're pushing towards. But I think to kind of state it that baldly and clearly is kind of eyebrow raising, where it makes you think, is that what I want? I'm not sure it is. But maybe that's where things are going.
But it depends on what they mean, because like if they mean it's all ATMs and no tellers, well, sure, we're going in that direction. Sure, you might need somebody every once in a while to handle some paper check when you're doing a mortgage or something like that, or that kind of thing. But I mean, companies are run by people, and if you have a big bank with a few million customers, you're going to have people. Like, it depends on how far they're trying to automate it. Because if they want to automate the entire customer experience front to back, but also like how it handles its investments, what it's doing with your money, how does it handle regulations? There's a lot of stuff that, I mean, I don't know what promise they made of like 0 people in this bank, but it's not going to be a completely autonomous bank, which is a terrifying idea, just like walking around.
Just an empty shell.
Yeah.
Well, to your point, I mean, maybe they've had a little bit of trouble convincing others because they are in the process of raising $100 million for this. It's not locked in yet. Ingrid has pointed out to me that the last attempt fell through. So maybe there is a little bit of a gap in understanding exactly what they're trying to pull off here. And maybe that is a little terrifying to investors. If there are some humans involved, though, however, I would say AI fintech startups are certainly quite popular these days. And there is an interesting element to what the company is trying to do. We'll see if they are able to raise more money, though. Devin, here is something that I do want you to explain to me, which is a deal. These ex-SpaceX engineers were able to raise about $14 million to scale this new method of 3D printing metal. So I want to know about the tech, aside from just the deal. Can you explain exactly what this startup Freeform is doing?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm sure most of our listeners are familiar with 3D printing in general. You put down material. It's called additive manufacturing more strictly because you add material rather than like cutting it away in like a CNC machine where you start with a block and cut away all the parts that aren't the thing you want. It's the opposite of that. You just add stuff in a stack or a pile, or it allows for interesting geometries and it makes it easy to manufacture various things. Additive, like 3D printing has been around for a while. Doing it with metal is harder though, because most 3D printing is done with like thermoplastic, which means you just melt plastic and then you put down little drops of it. But if you're doing it with metal, obviously metal has a higher melting temperature. It's harder to work with, blah, blah, blah. But people have been doing it for a long time. And among them, the SpaceX people. And these guys were at SpaceX. The CEO, one of the co-founders and CEO, he was like the lead guy on the Merlin engine and a bunch of other stuff. Like this is a serious engineering thing. And they did 3D printing using metal. But he was like, it sucks. It really sucks. It's slow. It's expensive. It's extremely complicated because of the way that you're dealing with this like powdered aluminum being like sintered into certain like droplet shapes at, 1100 degrees using multiple lasers. It's very complicated. And he was like, everybody was hitting the same walls and everybody wants to use it because you can do really cool stuff with it. And he was like, I got in a bunch of fights with Elon about this because he was like, oh, this is really useful. Like do more of this, but make it cost less. And he's like, it doesn't cost less. You have to invent something new. So they left and invented something new. And basically what they added was it's kind of a control mechanism, like an AI thing. I was like, is it really AI? And he was like, we started saying it was AI before everybody started saying everything was AI. But he was like, it's basically a machine learning model that watches very, very, very closely the little blob of molten metal that they're manipulating or creating with lasers and powder, like metal powder. And it can adjust the process thousands of times a second. So it's like, oh, the laser needs to be like 2% less intense because the metal is becoming too liquid, it's going to run. Then like 2 milliseconds later, you're like, no, it's too cold. Like heat it back up again. And like, move it a fraction of a centimeter to the left. It's that kind of like real-time monitoring that needed to be done. But the technology to do it didn't exist. And the technology, not just to monitor it, but to execute it at speed, they needed a model, an AI model that could make those decisions on a millisecond basis. But that didn't exist. So they had to build all this stuff up. And then you can't even run that model because you don't have the infrastructure to run the model. So they had to make that up too. So they've been building all this stuff up from scratch. And it's been a huge challenge. But they love a challenge. They got the money. And now they're actually doing it. And they're like, yeah, it actually works.
It actually works.
We are building stuff. Yeah. I mean, that was their conclusion. They're like,
that's always good.
Yeah. After all that, and after that long ass explanation, sorry, but you asked it from,
I know, sorry. Okay, audience, when we ask Devin a highly technical question, just get cozy and settle in because you're gonna.
Our producer can put that at 1.25, so you can just zoom through it. But it really does. It works and it's really cool. And it only works because of all this really high level technical work they've put into it. I'm surprised, honestly, that they only raised $14 million because this is the kind of thing that is going to be used. They're like, basically, if you make metal parts, this is going to be useful to you. And they already have a bunch of clients in space and industry, oil and gas. So, I mean, maybe they're just not raising too much because they know they're going to make money.
Well, maybe raising $14 million was on purpose, so they didn't just give away their entire company, and they don't really need that much money. So we'll wait and see about that, but possible props there.
I do think that also reflects how big the numbers have gotten, particularly when we're talking about AI companies, where it's just like, oh, here's a company with some pedigree, and it's a new AI startup, so automatically they're going to raise $100 million, whereas like $14 million is a big round for an early stage company.
It totally is. And I know my perspective is skewed, especially covering AI companies where it's like $150 million. They're going to be broke by summer because they just throw it down the hole. But like, and here's a company that is literally, they have to build these machines. They're making this stuff from scratch to like shoot lasers at metal powder and like make rockets. And they're like, oh, 14 million, that'll do me. Like, okay.
Well, shooting lasers at powder, I have these really cool images in my head of what is actually going on at that company. The thing to me that is probably the most interesting is the variety of customers they can have. I mean, you mentioned that this was kind of concept, not the invented concept of freeform, but the basic concept of 3D printing metal was being used at SpaceX, but there's all these other applications too, beyond what I would think would be aerospace. But like I think of automotive, I think of like energy sectors. So the good news for them is if they can make this efficient enough, they have a wide variety of customers they can pitch to.
Yeah, and there's an aspect of wanting to move manufacturing back to the US too. It's not just like a nationalistic thing. It's like, well, if you want to build a factory in the US, you have to go through all the tooling and make only this specific part, and then you have to spend $5 million and a couple of weeks retooling it to make this part. Or you can invest in a metal 3D printing factory that can do 2 of this part and then 5 of this part and then 1,000 of this other part. That could be a better way to invest in the stateside manufacturing infrastructure. Very forward thinking, very futuristic, supports the space industry. So they're kind of going for that, like, hey, if you're going to build a factory, put us in it, not like some big old stamping machine.
Well, the other thing that I thought was interesting, and this is the perfect segue to our themes, which we will get to right after the break, which is that they do real-time monitoring by GPU, FPGA, which they call an AI on steroids combo that they built from scratch. And to that point, after the break, we're going to talk about NVIDIA, GPUs, and Andreessen Horowitz.
It's time banking did more than hold your money. Now it can. With Mercury, you can pay bills in seconds, close the books faster, and even send invoices. Not only does Mercury do away with a patchwork of tools, it eliminates guesswork, giving you complete and accurate visibility into your business finances, all from one account. Apply in minutes at mercury.com.
We are back, and as I teased before, we want to talk about VCs renting a bunch of NVIDIA GPUs. I would love to dig into this. So it sort of starts with Andreessen Horowitz confirming its program called Oxygen, which allows their portfolio companies to train or operate their AI models without negotiating market rates. I know Devin has an opinion on this, so we'll get to you.
I'm waiting.
I'm wondering if this is the first that either of you have heard of a VC firm, granted, a well-known, well-capitalized one, even doing anything like this? Or is this the first?
I haven't heard of a VC doing this specific thing, but it feels like kind of on a spectrum with before, I think, a lot of firms, including, the firm that I worked for a couple of years, where you're helping your portfolio companies negotiate deals with the cloud providers and basically just this idea of like, well, we want to be a platform, which in the VC world is such a nebulous term. Obviously, like Andreessen Horowitz, they're one of the first people to really kind of popularize that, and they do it in a much more serious way than, frankly, most VCs do. So in a way, this feels like, oh yeah, I haven't heard of anyone doing this before, but it makes sense and seems like something that a lot of startups would be appreciative of.
Yeah, it turns out actually, this isn't the first time this has happened. Nat Friedman and Daniel Gross have a similar thing. They've got a few thousand GPUs they call their Andromeda cluster, which is actually, that's an astronomical reference or astronomy reference. Very nice. Thanks, guys. But it's certainly a bigger chunk. And the GPUs that we're talking about specifically are H100s, which are they're sort of the gold standard in AI training and inference. They're very hard to get hold of. So if you can get 100 of them, let alone 20,000, that's a pretty big foot up in a foot up? That's a pretty big leg up in the industry.
You have all the wrong cliches today, Devin. I know that there was one earlier today that I didn't want to call you out on, but that's strike 2. I wanted to mention that YC also offers startups training runs through partnerships. Again, not anything to the scale, I think. But to me, what this is reflective of is that this is a bit of an old storyline, but everyone is scrambling to get their hands on GPUs, right? And a company or a VC firm that can offer that, it is highly attractive. I can't imagine that to me, it seems like an amazing recruitment tool or a way of attracting startups to sign on potentially to you.
It's definitely clever. It may not be the first time, but it's timely. And everybody needs, if you're an AI startup, which is practically every startup now, You need to do inference at least because you don't want to be tied to OpenAI's API or whatever. You want to try and run some of your models offline or in some, independent way. So it's good to have that inference capability or to train a little thing and not have to pay market rates. So because it's like, who you're going to pay? Google, Microsoft, Amazon, they're all going to charge you same as everybody else. But if your investor is like, hey, come to us and, we'll give you half that rate. It's good for everybody in that little ecosystem. So it's a clever move. And I wonder whether Andreessen Horowitz learned this when they were doing crypto stuff, because that's another very computation heavy industry. And it's like I joked when we were talking about this, we were like, oh, wow, that's a lot of GPUs. I was like, did they put a pre-order down in like 2021 for a bunch for crypto stuff? And then crypto just like disappeared. And they're like, what are we going to do with these 20,000 H100s? Which I don't think they actually own them. I think they're like leasing them or something like that. But they ended up with this huge resource. And they're like, oh, thank God, an entire new industry has appeared beneath our feet that desperately needs this resource. But, they're in the right place at the right time, or they made a canny investment. Like, it could go either way.
Yeah, I mean, we'll just say that they're super clever. And then also perhaps it was serendipitous at the same time. Wondering how many of these companies or VCs that were like betting on things around crypto, which were highly computational, if they were thinking about this ahead of time. Because if you recall, there was also not just GPU shortage, but like an overall chip shortage because of the pandemic. And I wonder if what we're seeing now is a few companies which were a little bit shell-shocked from what was happening, like even on the industrial side of things, not just like VCs like Andreessen Horowitz, sort of starting to forecast and say, we don't ever want that to happen again. Let's start making some moves now to protect ourselves. And then in the background, another incredibly highly computational heavy industry, AI, just took off. So it gets a little bit away what we were talking about, but it is interesting to see how this one company has sort of positioned itself.
No, it makes perfect sense. It is smart to recognize, especially over the last 10 years, you're like, well, look, data centers are just growing and growing and growing. Intel or AWS or whoever is investing like crazy in these things, building them like crazy. They're only getting more powerful, more efficient. Everybody's always using them. Why don't we invest in some of our own? Whether that's a little cluster in the office to do some testing, or if it's a big cluster to resell to your portfolios, or even just on the open market. Like, it's easy to rent these things out. Like, there are services where it's like, hey, do you have 100 GPUs you're not using? Put them on our thing and we'll give them work and we'll take half of the money. It's a resource that has become sort of universally valuable. And crypto was an example of that. But before that, it was, just for serving video over the cloud and bandwidth and stuff like that. I think it's smart to invest in infrastructure.
Okay, advice of the day. Anthony, do you have anything else to add?
I guess I would just circle back to what you were saying earlier, Kirsten, about cost as well. And I do think with a lot of these new technologies, not all the time, but sometimes we talk about them as if they're sort of just like online magic. And remembering, actually, you need a ton of infrastructure to pull this off, uses a ton of energy, has a huge impact on the climate if it becomes more popular and widely used. And I don't think that's a reason not to pursue these technologies. But I think sometimes rhetorically, people sort of like hand wave that away. And it's just good to remember that there is a huge cost associated with these things.
I want to add just on that note as well, there's a cost associated with the cost. People aren't talking about this yet. People talk about the energy cost, but there's going to be a huge hardware disposal cost. I'm looking at a paper right now that's coming out in a couple of days in Nature that's about the EWaste results of like generative AI, and it's large. All these things, all these H100s, all the like server racks and stuff that they go on, that has to go somewhere. When the H100s are, old hat, people are going to say, oh, we'll just throw them in the trash or recycle them or whatever. That's going to be like millions of tons of e-waste going straight into the, this is like this unprecedented investment in computing infrastructure only lasts a couple of years before it's obsolete. And then you throw it away and it ends up in a heap in Bangladesh with a bunch of people picking over it to get the lithium and gold out of it.
Wow, what an uplifting way to end that segment, Devin. I truly appreciate that. Picking over the leftovers. Let's move on to something slightly more positive, actually really positive, which is Disrupt Battlefield 2024. Okay, I need to give a little bit of a shout out to Anthony because when I joined TechCrunch in 2018, it was my first Disrupt. And Anthony, you were like the face and the voice of Battlefield. So Thank you for coming back. I'm so excited. Things have changed a little bit since that era, which is now we have a different kind of selection process. And Devin and I were one of many who were part of this very long selection process. 200 companies were selected from around the world, 20 of which will get to pitch on stage. And Anthony, that's where you're going to come in. I'm wondering if you can give the listening audience insight, not pick any winners, of course, but insight into like what that process is like, because you're old hat at all this.
Yeah. So like you said, there's this whole process that takes place before we get to San Francisco for Disrupt. And maybe you guys can also speak more to sort of what it was like to go through the applications, because we get a lot of applications and there's a lot of great companies, but also a lot of not so great companies. But certainly by the time we get to the 20 that pitch on stage, the hope is that they're all really strong and they will present for 6 minutes. Basically, we ask that they do a live demo, and that can mean very different things for different companies, but it's not just a pitch deck. You're supposed to go on stage and show us your technology and show us that it works. And then there's a panel of expert, usually VC judges. They get 6 minutes of questions. If you do the math, that's 12 minutes total on stage, which is not a lot of time. And I think that's one of the things that makes Disrupt and the Startup Battlefield really different from a lot of other pitch-offs, is that whereas almost any other event, I think they can be great and they sometimes can go deeper than we can, frankly. It also means you just get a lot of like boring like pitches and it just kind of goes on and on and on. And Battlefield is merciless. You get on and you have to just deliver your message super quickly. I mean, that's really the main reason I'm on stage, is to introduce people and kind of give them the metaphorical hook when they're running over. So it's a really fast-paced, intense presentation.
Yeah, I mean, isn't there like a famous story, it was before my time, where Dropbox, which of course went on to like amazing success, didn't they like struggle in their live demo?
I don't remember if it was live, or I think it was live in the sense that you could, not just in terms of live on stage, but it was like, go to this link and sign up for Dropbox, and they were not prepared for how many signups they have. I don't think they're the only ones, but yeah, they're certainly one of the most famous.
Yeah, just one example of like how it's a pressure cooker, if you will. But, you know, it's fun. It's usually packed during these 20 pitches. Devin, I don't know if you have any that you are particularly interested in or that you're paying attention to, probably AI and space. Were there any companies that stood out to you this year?
Well, first of all, Kirsten, I want to, if you're going to make fun of my idioms, I'm going to make sure that you know that Anthony is not old hat at this. He's an old hand at this. Because I've been waiting.
Okay, thank you.
Been waiting to make that clear. So that now that that's out of the way, I really enjoyed our selection process, as Anthony noted. Like, we were very hands-on. The whole editorial team was in there, like, sorting through this huge pile. It was really hard to say no to a lot of startups. Like, getting it down to 200 was really hard, and then picking the 20 was really, really hard. I had a lot where I was like, this is actually really cool. And so it really is the best of the best who are up there. In the past, I feel sometimes companies will be up there because it's like, oh, they're going to get bought by Google in 2 months for $50 million, and that's going to be a quick turnaround for the investors. But I think there's more of a focus on doing something different and interesting, even if it's not necessarily an immediate, oh, you know, like Salesforce will love this, or, you know, we're reinventing the CRM stack or whatever. Sorry to all my enterprise software lovers out there. But no, I think that there's a real diversity of stuff. There's space, there's health and biotech, there's, of course, there's the enterprise, and there's consumer stuff. It's a good mix that I think really represents the different interests of the TechCrunch like editorial team and like the diversity of the startup ecosystem. It's not just people trying to make money, it's people trying to do something new. I think that we're able to emphasize that a bit.
Yeah, I will say, I'm not going to put Anthony on the spot because it would put him in such a weird position to like talk about things that he is interested in and he's introducing them. So you're in the clear unless you really feel strongly about a particular one, Anthony.
I don't have any particular favorites. I would just double down on what Devin said, that I think when I first started, and before I was emceeing it, or before I was even at TechCrunch and I was going to Disrupt and the sort of precursor events, like it was really a Silicon Valley consumer internet event. And it's been so cool to see that it's become a global event for startups from pretty much any sector that you can imagine. I mean, it definitely creates challenges. You guys talked about the selection process. I think the judges often struggle with this too, is they'll sort of look at each other and be like, how do I say this company is better than this company? They're so different, but that's why they make the big bucks.
At least the judges aren't already investing in the companies like they used to be in the early days.
I will say this. So, Devin, you gave kind of a good overview of like all the different sectors. One thing I was happy to see was that it wasn't all AI startups. So there were some really interesting ones, like in my world. So sustainability, mobility, logistics. There was obviously a lot of like warehouse robotic stuff, but then some interesting crossover. The use cases were not just what you might think. It's also like could be used for mobility. To your point, there was a lot of health tech and biotech, which I thought was interesting. So I was like just happy to see that we didn't get like thousands of AI applications.
Yeah, well, or we did because, me and Kyle were looking at them.
We did, but there were a lot of other ones. And then also, certainly a lot from the Bay Area or from California, but from all over the country and from all over the world. Some really interesting ones from like Africa, for instance, that were looking at mobility and healthcare in a different way. So to me, that shows how much Disrupt and specifically Startup Battlefield has grown over the years. And also, maybe there are ones out there that are going to make the world a better place, Devin, to use a really tired line. Silence.
I was just going to let that one lay there.
Just absolute silence. Yeah, I'm going to let it lay there too. All right. I think that'll do it for today's episode. So thank you again, Devin and Anthony. And I forgive you for making fun of me a few times. It's okay. If you see something that you want to talk to us about, hit us up on @EquityPod on X and Threads, and I will hopefully see you all at Disrupt.
Equity is produced by Teresa Loconsolo with editing by Kel. Bryce Durbin is our illustrator, and we'd like to give a big thanks to our audience development team and Henry Pickavett, who manages TechCrunch audio products. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.